I sit in my therapist's office, hesitating to ask that question. Then I ask her, so how do I know if it's just me needing to be alone because I'm an introvert or preferring to isolate because of early trauma? And she leans forward, looks me in the eyes and says, Robert, aren't you seeing me because you're emotionally triggered when other people are around? The need to be alone is felt by many of us. But is it because there are suddenly a lot of introverts among us, or is it because many of us use isolation to cope with our distrust in other people and the world? In other words, isn't isolation just another sign of a learned avoidant attachment style? In today's episode, I'd like to find that out. So we compare avoidance and introversion. And I talk you through 5 signs that it's actually avoidance and not introversion. And in the end, we look for an answer to the question if we need or more like to be alone and what we can do about it. Welcome to today's episode. My name is Robert, and today we compare avoidance and introversion. And to start today's episode, I'd like to start with the definitions in general of introversion and avoidance to get a better understanding of what that actually is. So, what is introversion? Introversion describes people who focus more of their attention and energy on their inner lives, and as a result, they like to withdraw and spend time alone. They tend to play the role of a passive observer in groups, and usually they are described by others as quiet, reserved, and shy. And by the way, shyness is not the same as introversion, because shyness describes the fear of entering a social situation or into social interactions with other people. And there are, of course, shy introverts as well as shy extroverts. And in comparison to introversion, extraversion, that's the other side basically, is found in people who focus their attention and energy more on their outer lives. Then what is avoidance? Avoidance appears as a typical symptom of CPTSD, so complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And avoidance is described, for example, in my favorite paper, Adult Survivors of Childhood Trauma. So we can see that here, avoidance as a typical symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And if you want to dive more into depth here, I'll link you the paper in today's description, so you can check that out. Avoidance is not just a symptom of CPTSD, but it's also a coping mechanism to better deal with emotions which couldn't be dealt with otherwise. So people who are avoidant, they might avoid facing difficult decisions, difficult emotions, so things that they don't want to feel in the end. And they do that by distracting themselves, for example, into work, into sports, but also substance abuse is a thing here. People might also avoid relationships because they're afraid of, in detail, re-experiencing early triggers and trauma again, which can come up, obviously, especially in romantic relationships, and therefore they prefer to be alone because they feel uncomfortable in situations where they could get hurt again. By the way, if you deal with avoidance, we have also an exclusive online community, and there are courses on avoidance and the need to isolate. You can access that at understandable.net/join. So if you feel that isolation and avoidance are actually a problem for you in your life, and you want to work specifically on that, I think that might be the right place for you. There are also other members who deal with the same challenges, so support is guaranteed. Go to understandable.net/join, become a member right now. Now let's talk about the need to be alone. What is actually behind that question? Do you like or do you need to be alone? Well, what is actually behind that question is, what many people of us would ask is, do I actually have a mental health problem right here? Or is this avoidance, this isolation need, just a normal part of my personality and as well of the personality of many other people out there? Or can I fix it, or do I need to fix it, or do I need just to accept it and focus more on the understanding of what I'm actually be and how I'm actually like? Well, first of all, I want to say it is of course super natural to be alone sometime and to have that need some time of the day. So there's obviously no mental health problem here if you sometimes have the need to feel alone or that you need to spend a couple hours a day alone. From an evolutionary point of view, people sometimes, of course, left the group, for example, to explore, to eat, to go to the toilet, or to think. But in order to survive, they always had to come back to the groups, or at least spend time together with one or two other people, again, to make surviving possible. And definitely don't get me wrong here, because alone time in general is a favorable thing, and it helps to regulate, to think, to set boundaries, to reflect, and of course to create personal intimacy. But is there a problematic side here as well with the need to be alone? Are there some unhealthy mental health conditions where isolation can be a part of? Let's explore this topic a bit more. First of all, again, if you need to withdraw and isolate because this is something that you need, or this is something that you learned to re-regulate yourself, definitely do so. It's an important strategy for you. It makes you feel calm, it makes you feel comfortable and safe, and those things are the most important priority here, of course. But if you deep down unconsciously long for intimacy, wish for closeness and safe relationships, then spending a lot of time alone in solitude and in full isolation might be an unfavorable strategy for you if that's your only strategy to re-regulate yourself. Being alone and living in solitude then subconsciously will make you frustrated and desperate. That's for sure. And to easily find out if that's actually the case for you, ask yourself if what I just said triggered you somehow emotionally. Because in that case, this strategy of isolating is resolvable for you if you want to resolve it. What is that need to be alone actually for? Why do we isolate ourselves? Well, behind that need to be alone and to avoid other people and to isolate, there's often basically a flight response from our nervous system. And some people will say, no, that's bullshit, I just like to be alone. Yes, that's also an option. But for those people who actually feel frustrated and desperate because they can't enter healthy relationships, this might be the thing here. Because this avoidant response, this flight response, is actually associated with the fear of experiencing early pain again in any kind, and therefore often causes a panic reaction. And this can also be explained using various models of the central nervous system, for example, the polyvagal theory here. According to the PVT, the polyvagal theory, we have basically 3 or 4 states, depends on how you see it, of the central nervous system. So it's a really nuanced system. We have the ventral vagal state, that's the calm state. Usually we enter that state when you have this problem, when you really like to be alone. We enter that state when we are alone, when we isolate ourselves. Being alone, and I know that for myself as well, gives us this feeling of comfort. Hell yeah, I'm alone, there's no one else, nothing to take responsibility for, no one to take responsibility for, no one who wants anything from me, no one who expects anything from me. It's just me being here, relaxed in that calm state. Then, from that, we have the so-called flight or fight state. That's a sympathetic state, and usually the avoidant reaction is also part of that. It is usually the flight response that gives us this feeling of that we need to isolate ourselves. If that's the case for you, then you might be someone who is avoidant. You might be someone who is afraid and feels fear and anxiety of particular emotional triggers. You don't want to re-experience certain situations that you have experienced early on in your life. And then, of course, there is the freeze response. If you stay in that situation, you might feel helpless, you might feel numb, you might dissociate. When you, for example, you feel that flight response, you want to isolate yourself because that is something that you learn to protect yourself, but you can't isolate yourself, or you just don't do it because you, for example, stay with a certain person within a relationship situation, then you might enter that freeze state, the dorsal vagal freeze state, where you then dissociate and you become blurry and numb and shut down and feel helpless in a way. This is what happens. Now, as we explored the avoidant side now for a bit, let's also explore the introvert side. Do introverts need alone time? Well, let's just suppose that usually as human beings, we don't need to isolate ourselves to regulate ourselves. Okay, that's an important distinction here. We don't need to isolate ourselves in order to regulate ourselves. That also means that we usually have the ability to regulate ourselves while other people are in our presence, while we are in a relationship, while we are in a group setting. Let's suppose that. Now, do introverts still need regular alone time? You might disagree with that now. I'm curious about that. Let me know in the comments if you disagree. So, the difference between an introvert and an extrovert is how the brain reacts to social rewards. So being at a party, for example, talking to strangers, driving a business, or doing any of these kind of exciting things, they produce less excitement and dopamine, that's the hormone behind that, the chemicals, in an introvert's brain than in an extrovert's brain. So introverts have a need for calmness, but not necessarily for solitude and isolation. TheMuse.com, for example, writes, it's an example here for an introvert, he likes to stay in his own apartment alone or just with another person, and then the level of stimulation feels just right. So being introvert doesn't mean that you necessarily need to isolate yourself entirely for most of the time to re-regulate yourself. It means that you need to spend time with less stimulation some of your time instead. It also means that you can re-regulate yourself with some trusted people around you, and it also doesn't mean that you only feel safe when you are in solitude. And this is basically the core of avoidance, of any form of avoidance, and what's behind that isolation need. When you don't feel safe and when you have distrust towards other people and the world, then you may not be able to re-regulate yourself in the presence of other people. So summarized, for introverts, withdrawing, spending time with just one other person or being alone for a couple hours a day is a healthy behavior. Of course, I don't want to put anyone in any category, but let's suppose that this is the normal, healthy general behavior here. And it also is like everything else. It has to be seen on a spectrum. So some introverts maybe need 30 minutes a day of complete alone time or just spending with one other person in a room. Others may need maybe 5 hours. Now, is your need for isolation and solitude larger than this? Do you only feel safe when you are in solitude, when you're completely alone and entirely avoid people and relationships, then I have 5 signs for you right now that you might prefer to be alone because it's a coping mechanism instead of actually needing your alone time. Sign number 1, you believe that people and relationships mean pain. Well, people mean pain is a phrase I often read here on YouTube. And that pain is linked to the distrust many people who feel the need to isolate experience in early years in their caregiver relationship. So they experience other people and the world around them as threatening. And their needs haven't been met and they haven't been seen or heard maybe. So what actually lies behind these experiences is usually an unfulfilled need for safety here. And many of us prefer to be alone because simply it's safer and it gives you that feeling of comfort and safety to be alone. And I can totally relate to that because I do that as well. But I also have to understand that I'm an adult now and that I can protect myself now. And I can learn to set better boundaries than earlier in life. And I can also learn, at least partly, to re-regulate myself when I'm surrounded with other people or my partner or friends. Is it easy? Hell not! It's a lot of work. It's really difficult. I'm struggling with that regularly. But is it worth it? I think so. For me, it's such a new and important component of actually feeling safe around other people, of even finding other people who I can trust in the end and who I can open up and feel safe around. Because that is also a huge component, and I see that many people, especially here on YouTube, comment that there is no one in this world who they can trust. So it is often then not just about them, no, it's also about those people who you spend time with, because there are people who you shouldn't trust 100%. There are people who are threatening to you. That's also for sure. But at the same time, there are also people who you can open up and where you can feel safe around. You just need to find them. Sign number 2, other people trigger you emotionally. That's a big one. Like in my situation in the intro, many people sit in front of their therapist each day because they get triggered, dysregulated, or they dissociate because of other people. And that's a typical sign here of missing boundaries and the inability to communicate your needs and an overall low self-worth. And if you need to be alone because if you see other people, you constantly get triggered, then this is also a clear sign here that you deal with patterns from the past and not just the need to be alone sometimes. Sign number 3, you can't set healthy boundaries. And this is also something that I experience myself quite a lot because I'm also someone with an avoidant attachment style, and avoidant people believe of themselves that they are really good in setting boundaries. I used to believe that all the time. They would say something like, I have very strict boundaries and others need to respect them. That might be true, but at the same time, what they usually do is they don't let others even getting close to them. They often also do not show up with others and avoid closeness and commitment if possible. The truth is, avoidant people struggle with setting healthy boundaries within a setting of close and intimate relationships. They often avoid close contact even entirely, so they don't have to set their boundaries and negotiate their needs. Sign number 4, you are a self or an autoregulator. Are you someone who works out everything with yourself? Then you might be an autoregulator. And that's typical for CPTSD survivors. Because often parents in the early years weren't present, not emotionally or visibly. and you couldn't express your emotions and needs to them, or you did that and they haven't been seen or heard. You didn't learn to co-regulate with others, and while others are present, you just learned to re-regulate yourself in solitude. And you also don't allow others to help you re-regulating because of, mistrust, because you just don't trust them and you learned that. So solitude and withdrawing, that is your basic strategy to re-regulate yourself. And that is why you need to isolate yourself and spend that much time alone. And sign number 5, you feel panic if there is no place to withdraw. Do you feel panic when there is no place to withdraw or isolate? You can simply ask that to yourself. For example, let's say you're on a trip with friends, with your partner, then that's a clear sign that you have the inability to re-regulate your nervous system, remember the polyvagal theory, around other people. And now let's talk about some solutions here. If you found yourself to be someone who isolates because you're afraid or get triggered in specific relationship situations that remind you of your past, and you feel at the same time that this is a problem in your life, that it makes you frustrated and desperate because you feel a need for intimacy and want close relationships. Now, what to do then? First of all, be brave and slowly try to break through those underlying fears and patterns from the past. Because that is the actual hard way that we all can go if we want to. And if we see that this is a problem for us in our relationship life. You can do that using, for example, shadow work, which I explained in this video here. What is also important is, if you love to be alone, that's totally fine. That's nothing to be ashamed of. That's not a problem at all. But if you feel, as I said, frustrated and desperate because some part of you also wishes for a healthy and safe relationship, then you have to find ways to increase your time with other people, preferably save time where you feel comfortable around other people, and at the same time, spend less time alone. And to do so, we have the option here to join our online community. So I have created that safe space for that. And in that safe space, you can learn exactly that and find like-minded people who deal with the same challenges. What is also important, and this is where we have online classes here for, is to learn to set healthy boundaries, to communicate your needs and express your emotions, to re-regulate your nervous system. So if you want to join our community and also get full access to online courses to learn exactly that, then you can become a member today at understandable.net/join. Just go there, fill the form, and become a member today. Again, understandable.net/join. And now, do you have to give up all your alone time because that's an unfavorable thing or that's a problem? Definitely not. As I pronounced, alone time is a favorable thing, but you have to keep it in balance if you at the same time wish for safe and healthy relationships. It's also not the goal to never isolate yourself neither, because we all do that naturally from time to time. As always, a healthy and favorable path lies somewhere in the middle. It's somewhere between spending time with people you trust, and of course you have to find those people first, and spending time alone in solitude. Both is necessary and needed for healthy relationships with others and with yourself. What do you think about that whole topic? Was that a triggering episode for you, or are you on the same page as me? Definitely leave me a comment below. I'm curious to read those today. And if you want to support the podcast, share the episode and leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And I see you next Sunday for another episode of Understandable here on the channel. Have a great day.